Wyoming Territory, winter of 1887. In the middle of the worst blizzard the region had seen in a decade. The lid tore open. Torchlight flooded in. Clara Vance looked up into the faces of three massive men. Blood still streaked across their coats, ice cold as steel. She opened her mouth to beg, but only a broken sob came out. No words at all. The scarred one, throat marked by an old wound, crouched down and stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then he reached in, careful, like he was handling something breakable, and lifted her out of the trunk that was supposed to seal her fate. She had no idea who these men were. No idea where they were taking her. She only knew that, for the first time in years, nobody was demanding she speak. But she never imagined her uncle's blood debt would come back to find her right inside. The home, she thought, was finally safe. The story of Clara Vance and the three mountain men who saved her and changed her life forever starts right now. Don't go anywhere. You won't want to miss how this one ends. The blizzard came down like it had a grudge against the whole territory. Wind screamed through the pass, driving snow sideways in sheets, so thick the stagecoach driver couldn't see past his own team. The horses fought the reins, half blind, half frozen, and then the front axle caught a buried rock and cracked clean through. The coach lurched, tipped, and went down hard on its side in a drift. Inside the cargo hold, Clara Vance felt the world flip. She'd been folded into the trunk for 6 hours by then, knees against her chest, breath fogging the wood an inch from her face. Her uncle had paid a man to nail the lid loose enough for air and tight enough to keep her quiet. She hadn't fought it. Fighting only made things worse. She'd learned that a long time ago, when the coach crashed. The trunk slid and slammed into the wall, and Clara bit down on a scream before it could leave her throat. Old habit. Her uncle used to say a stuttering girl who screamed too was more trouble than she was worth. Outside, gunfire cracked through the storm. She heard men shouting, horses screaming. The driver's voice cut short. Then nothing but wind. Clara pressed her palm flat against the trunk's lid and waited to die. Or worse, waited to be found by whoever had just killed everyone on that road. Boots crunched closer, slow, deliberate. The lid came off in one hard pull, and torchlight spilled in. And Clara looked up into the faces of three men who did not look like rescuers. They were huge. Snow crusted their shoulders, and blood, not their own by the look of the wounds on two of the dead outlaws behind them, streaked across their coats. The tallest one crouched down first. His eyes were pale in the torchlight, and there was a scar across his throat, thick and white, like something had tried to open him up years ago, and hadn't quite finished the job. He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say a word. None of them did. Clara opened her mouth to beg. Nothing came out but a broken sound. Half syllable, half sob. Her tongue caught on the first letter, the way it always did when fear grabbed her by the throat. She tried again. Still nothing. The scarred man's jaw tightened, just slightly, like he understood exactly what he was looking at. He reached into the trunk, careful, the way a man might reach for something breakable, and lifted her out into the cold. She should have run. There was nowhere to run. The second man, broader through the shoulders, with a gentleness in his eyes that didn't match his size, wrapped a heavy fur coat around her before she could even shiver. He tilted his head toward her, studying her face, and she noticed then that he watched her mouth more than her eyes, like he was reading something there she hadn't said out loud. The third man stood apart, rifle still raised, scanning the tree line like the storm itself might be hiding more trouble. His eyes had a wildness to them, quick and restless, never landing anywhere for long. When he finally looked at her, something in his face flickered, and then he turned away just as fast, back to the dark. They hadn't come for gold. Clara understood that much from the way they tore through the wreckage, kicking aside crates, ignoring the strongbox altogether. They'd come for something else, some debt owed to them by the man who'd hired this coach. And instead they'd found her, a girl locked in a trunk, meant for delivery like a crate of dry goods. The scarred man crouched again, this time in front of the open strongbox. One of his brothers had pried loose. Inside sat a folded paper with her name on it, and the terms of her sale written out in her uncle's careful hand, and the seal of a mining baron, 3 counties over. The man read it slow. His face didn't change, but his knuckles went white around the paper. He looked back at her. Clara flinched, waiting for whatever came next. A blow. A word she wouldn't be able to answer fast enough. Instead, he folded the paper once, twice, and tucked it inside his coat, like he meant to keep it for later. Then he pointed north, toward a ridge she couldn't see through the snow, and looked at his brothers. Some silent agreement passed between the 3 of them. Quick as breath, the broad one lifted her again, easy as lifting a child, and started walking. Clara didn't fight him. She was too cold to fight, too frightened to do anything but grip the front of his coat and let her head fall against his shoulder. The wind kept howling. The snow kept falling. Somewhere behind them, the wreckage of the coach and the men who'd taken her uncle's money were already disappearing under white. She didn't know where they were taking her. She didn't know their names, their reasons, or what waited for her when the storm let up. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, nobody around her was demanding she speak. And somehow, in the middle of a blizzard, surrounded by 3 silent strangers with blood on their hands, Clara Vance felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt safe. The cabin came up out of the snow, like something carved from the mountain itself. Clara saw through half-frozen lashes, a low, sturdy shape with smoke curling from a stone chimney. Windows shuttered tight against the storm. The broad one carrying her shifted his grip as they climbed the porch steps, careful not to jostle her. And for a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined the gentleness of it, if cold and fear were playing tricks on her mind. Then the door opened, and warmth hit her like a wall. Inside was one long room, a hearth crackling at one end, a table scarred from years of use, furs stacked along the walls for winter. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something simmering in a pot. It didn't smell like fear. Clara had spent so many years learning what fear smelled like in a room that the absence of it nearly undid her. The broad man set her down near the fire, and she swayed on her feet, legs stiff from hours folded inside a trunk. She caught the edge of the table to steady herself. Her whole body trembled, not just from the cold now, but from the sheer weight of not knowing what came next. The scarred one, the leader, she guessed, from the way the other 2 watched him, crossed the room and pulled the folded paper from his coat, her marriage contract. He set it on the table in front of her, smoothed it flat with one hand, and looked at her. Clara's stomach dropped. She thought he meant to hold her to it, to remind her what she'd been sold as, what she still was in the eyes of the law 3 counties over. She opened her mouth, and the words tangled the way they always did when panic got there first. Please, she managed. I didn't. I never wanted. He didn't wait for her to finish. He picked the paper back up, walked to the hearth, and dropped it into the flames. Clara watched it curl and blacken and disappear. She watched so long she forgot to breathe. When she looked back at him, he was already reaching for something else. A thin slate board hanging from a nail by the door, and a stub of chalk tied to it with a leather cord. He wrote on it slow, pressing hard enough that she could hear the scratch of it, even over the fire. Then he turned it around and held it out to her. You are safe. When the snow melts, you go free. Clara read it twice, 3 times. Her eyes burned, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth to keep the sound in. Nobody had ever written her a promise before. Nobody had ever needed to, because promises were the kind of thing men made when they intended to keep them, and the men in her life so far had never seen the point. She looked up at him, this stranger, with a scar across his throat and blood still drying on his sleeve, and tried to find words, any words. Her mouth worked around the shape of thank you, and nothing came out but a broken breath. He watched her struggle. He didn't look away, and he didn't fill the silence for her, the way people sometimes did, rushing in with their own words to cover the gap. making her feel smaller for taking so long to speak. He just waited, patient as stone. It was, Clara realized, the first time in her life a man had ever waited for her. The broad one, the gentle giant of the three, set a bowl of stew in front of her and gestured for her to sit. She caught him watching her mouth again, the same careful attention from the wreckage, and it took her a moment to understand why. He tilted his head toward his own ear, the left one, and shook his head slightly. Deaf on that side, she guessed. Maybe more than that. He hadn't spoken a single word since she'd been pulled from that trunk, not even to his brothers. The third man, the restless one with the quick, wild eyes, hadn't come inside yet. Through the window, she could see him pacing the porch, rifle across his shoulder, watching the tree line like the storm might still be hiding something worse than weather. And thank you, Clara finally managed, the words coming out thin and cracked. For not, she stopped. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. For not hurting me. For not selling me again to the next man with money. For not demanding I explain myself in a voice that works right. The scarred man reached for the slate again. My name is Silas. He turned it, pointed to the giant. Gideon, then to the window, where the third brother's shape moved through the snow. Cole? Clara nodded. She tried their names in her head, careful, like handling something fragile. Silas. Gideon. Cole. She didn't try to say them out loud yet. Not tonight. Her voice had used up everything. It had just getting out a thank you. Silas set the slate down within her reach and gestured toward it, an offer instead of a demand. If it's easier. It was easier. She picked up the chalk with a hand that still shook and wrote, small and careful. I don't talk right. My uncle. He didn't like waiting. Silas, read it. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. He took the chalk from her, wrote one more line beneath hers, and slid it back. We're not in a hurry. Clara looked at those 4 words for a long time. Outside, the wind kept screaming against the shutters, and the fire kept crackling. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, nobody in the room was waiting for her to be anything other than exactly what she was. Cole came in eventually, shaking snow from his shoulders, rifle set carefully by the door. He didn't look at her right away. He moved to the fire, warmed his hands, and only then let his eyes cut sideways toward the table where she sat. Clara caught the look. It wasn't unkind. It was searching, the way a man searches a room for exits. Except he was searching her face instead, like he was trying to work out what kind of trouble had walked into his home. She understood that look. She'd spent her whole life being sized up by people, trying to decide what use she was. But nobody demanded anything of her that night. Gideon showed her, with gestures and patient repetition, where the blankets were kept, where the water barrel sat, how the latch on the shutters worked in case the wind got worse. Silas wrote out a few more lines on the slate. Simple things. This is your room. The fire needs wood twice in the night. Don't go out past the porch in the dark. Cole said nothing at all. But before she lay down on the narrow cot they'd made up for her near the fire, she found an extra fur laid across the foot of it that hadn't been there an hour before. She didn't know which of them had put it there. She suspected, from the careful, almost embarrassed way none of them met her eyes when she noticed it, that it might have been all 3. Clara lay awake a long time that night, listening to the wind, listening to the quiet breathing of 3 men who asked nothing of her and gave without being asked. She thought of her uncle's house, the sharp voice, the sharper hand, the years of learning to make herself small and silent because silence was safer than the alternative. Here, in a cabin full of men who couldn't speak or wouldn't, the silence felt different. It didn't feel like something she had to earn by disappearing. It felt like something they'd built on purpose, brick by careful brick, and were letting her live inside of. She fell asleep before she meant to, and for the first time in years, she didn't dream of her uncle's voice at all. The storm didn't let up for 3 days. Clara learned the shape of the cabin the way a person learns a new language, slow and careful, watching for the rules nobody bothered to explain, because nobody spoke enough to explain them. She learned that Gideon liked his coffee before anyone else got near the pot, and that he always left the last of the bread for whoever hadn't eaten yet. She learned that Cole disappeared for an hour every morning to check the traps and came back quieter than when he left, like the cold scraped something raw in him. She learned that Silas watched the door more than the fire, always angled so he could see it, even when he sat. Nobody explained why. Nobody had to. She was starting to read the shape of things without words, the same way they seemed to read her. On the third morning, she decided to make herself useful. She'd noticed the way the cabin ran. 3 men doing the work of 10, hunting and hauling wood and mending fence line even in a blizzard. And she couldn't stand the thought of being one more mouth to feed with nothing given back. So she rose before the others, found the stew pot and the dried venison hanging near the hearth, and set about making breakfast the way she used to. Back before her uncle decided, cooking was beneath a girl meant to be sold off proper. Her hands remembered even when her voice didn't. She was reaching for a stack of ceramic bowls on the high shelf when her fingers slipped. The bowl hit the floor and shattered, and the sound of it, sharp and sudden in the quiet cabin, sent something through Clara that had nothing to do with the bowl at all. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. She dropped to her knees, arms curling over her head, and the apology came out of her in a rush, broken and stuttering. Please. I'm sorry. I'll be quiet. Please don't. Please. The words tumbling over each other, so fast they barely made sense. Old words. Ones she hadn't spoken out loud in months, but had never stopped hearing in her own head. Her breath came too fast. The room narrowed to a point of white noise and her own racing heart. And somewhere distant, she was aware of movement, of boots on the floor, of someone's shadow falling over her, and every part of her flinched. Bracing for a hand she was certain was coming. It didn't come. Instead, someone lowered themselves to the floor in front of her, slow, deliberate, making noise on purpose, the way a person does when they want to be heard coming. Clara opened her eyes enough to see Cole kneeling in the wreckage of the bowl, close but not too close, his hands empty and open where she could see them. He didn't reach for her right away. He swept the broken shards aside first, careful, unhurried. Clearing a space on the floor between them like that mattered more than anything else in the world. Then he sat back on his heels and waited. Clara's breath kept hitching, short and useless, and the shame of it, of falling apart over a bowl, of being exactly the fragile, foolish thing her uncle always said she was, pressed down on her chest until she thought she might be sick. Cole reached out, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted to, and rested one hand flat between her shoulder blades. He didn't grip. He didn't pull her in. He just let the weight of his hand sit there, warm and steady, and began to move it in small, slow circles. Nobody had ever touched her like that. Not once. Not in her whole life. Clara didn't know how long they stayed like that. Him kneeling in broken pottery, tracing patterns on her back while she shook apart and slowly put herself back together. Long enough for her breathing to even out. Long enough for the white noise in her ears to fade and the room to come back into focus. The fire, the table. Silas standing near the doorway with his jaw tight and his hands fisted at his sides, not moving closer, giving them room. Gideon by the window, watching his own face carved with something that looked like grief for a girl he barely knew. When Clara finally lifted her head, Cole was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity. She'd had enough of pity to know its shape, and this wasn't it. This was something closer to recognition, like he'd seen that particular kind of fear somewhere before, maybe even worn it himself. He reached for the slate, since it sat close enough, and wrote 3 words in his rough, uneven hand. Not your fault. Clara stared at those words until they blurred. She wanted to argue. Some old, deep part of her wanted to insist that it was her fault, that clumsiness deserved punishment, that a good girl didn't break things and cower and fall apart over a bowl. But looking at Cole's steady eyes, at the patience in 3 men who had every reason to be furious with a stranger, destroying their kitchenware, and instead knelt in the mess to make sure she was all right. That old voice started to sound less like truth and more like something her uncle had built in her on purpose, brick by brick, the same way these men were building something else. She picked up the chalk. Her hand still trembled, but less now. Nobody ever knelt down for me before. Cole read it. Something shifted in his face, quick and fierce, gone as fast as it came. He didn't write anything back. He just reached out again, careful, and helped her to her feet, steadying her when her knees didn't want to hold. Silas crossed the room then, picked up the broom without a word, and swept the last of the shards away himself. Gideon set a fresh bowl on the table, one from the good set, the kind Clara suspected they didn't use often, like it was some small ceremony of its own. They ate breakfast together, and Clara noticed, for the first time, that the silence in the cabin didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a promise kept over and over, in small ways, in the space they gave her, in the patience they didn't have to offer, but did anyway. Their silence wasn't a weapon. It never had been. It was a shield, and somehow, without a single one of them saying so out loud, they'd decided to hold it up for her that night, lying on her cot with the fire burned low. Clara pressed her palm flat against her own chest and felt her heart beating slow and steady for the first time in years. She thought about Cole's hand on her back, tracing patterns instead of raising a fist. She thought about Silas burning her contract in the hearth. She thought about Gideon's careful attention to her mouth, reading what she couldn't always say. 3 men who couldn't speak, or wouldn't, had said more to her in 3 days than her uncle had managed to say kindly in 18 years. She fell asleep with the chalk dust still faint on her fingers, and for once, she didn't dream at all. The avalanche came without warning, the way disasters in the high country always seemed to. Clara heard it before she understood what it was, a low groan deep in the mountain's bones, building fast into a roar that shook dust from the rafters. Gideon was on his feet before the sound even finished, hauling her back from the window. And through the shuttering glass, she watched a wall of white come down the eastern slope and bury the trail they'd used to reach the cabin. It buried the meat shed, too. When the roar finally settled into silence, Silas was already pulling on his coat, Cole close behind him, both men moving with the quick, grim efficiency of people who'd faced hard winters before and knew exactly what a lost meat shed meant. Clara stood in the middle of the cabin, heart still hammering, and understood without being told that the easy days, the slow, careful days of learning names and reading slates, were over for a while. They came back an hour later with nothing. The shed was crushed flat under 12 feet of snow and rock, their winter stores gone with it, and what remained in the cabin's small root cellar would have to stretch for weeks longer than anyone had planned. Silas laid it out on the slate that night, while the others ate in grim silence. Rations halved. No more trail out until the pass clears. Hunting until then. Clara read it and felt something rise in her that surprised even herself. Not fear. She'd expected fear. Instead, she felt the old, stubborn part of her that had survived 18 years under her uncle's roof, waking up and squaring its shoulders. She wasn't going to be one more mouth eating into rations. 3 men needed to survive. The next morning, she rose before dawn again, found Gideon already awake and measuring out feed for the horses in the lean-to, and without a word, took up a scoop and started helping. He glanced at her, surprised, then simply moved over to make room. They worked in silence, breath fogging in the cold barn air, and by the time the sun came up, they'd finished in half the time it would have taken him alone. It became a pattern over the following days. Clara found the places she could help without being asked, mending torn gloves by the fire, stretching the dwindling stores of flour and dried meat into meals that lasted, hauling water so the men could spend their daylight hours hunting instead. She wasn't a fragile thing to be protected behind locked doors. She'd never had the luxury of being fragile. She only hadn't had anyone worth working for before. Silas noticed. She caught him watching her more than once, some unreadable calculation behind his pale eyes, like he was recalculating everything he'd assumed about the girl they'd pulled out of a trunk in a blizzard. One evening, with the last of the light fading gold through the shutters, He set a rifle on the table in front of her. Clara looked at it, then at him, uncertain. He picked up the slate. You should know how to use this, in case. She didn't ask in case of what. She didn't need to. Out here, on a mountain cut off from the rest of the world, a person who couldn't protect herself was a person waiting for tragedy to find her. He walked her out to the edge of the tree line, where he'd set up a row of pine cones along a fallen log, and showed her how to hold the Winchester properly, how to seat it against her shoulder so it wouldn't kick her half off her feet, how to sight down the barrel and breathe out slow before she pulled the trigger. His hands were careful when they corrected her stance. He didn't grab her the way a man in a hurry might, jerking her elbow up, snapping her shoulder square. He touched her the way he wrote on that slate, deliberate, patient, waiting to see if she'd flinch before he ever pressed his palm flat against her lower back to straighten her spine. She didn't flinch, not that time. Like this, she asked, the words coming slower than she meant, but steadier than they'd been 3 days before. He nodded, and something in his face, so rarely expressive, eased into what she was starting to recognize as approval. She missed the first shot by a mile. The second went wide. By the fifth, she clipped the edge of a pine cone and sent it spinning off the log. And the small, startled sound of triumph that escaped her was the loudest thing she'd said since the wreck. Silas's mouth curved, just barely, at the corner. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was the ghost of one. The kind a man wore when he'd forgotten he still had the muscles for it. They practiced every evening after that, when the hunting was done, and the horses were fed, and there was an hour of light left to spend. Clara's aim improved. So did something else, something harder to name, a kind of ease that grew between them in the space where words used to be required, and now weren't. She learned things about Silas in those quiet hours that no slate could have told her. The way he squared his shoulders before every shot, like he was bracing for a war that had never quite ended for him. The careful, deliberate way he moved his hands, like a man who'd learned the cost of moving carelessly. The scar at his throat that he never mentioned and she never asked about. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood, better than most, what it meant to carry a wound you didn't want to explain out loud. One evening, reloading the rifle for another round, her fingers brushed his as he passed her the cartridges. Neither of them pulled away right away. The air between them, cold and thin with mountain twilight, seemed to hold its breath. Clara looked up at him, this silent, careful man who'd burned her contract, and waited for her to find her own words, and never once, not in all the days since the wreck, made her feel like anything less than a person worth protecting. Something was building between them. She felt it the way she'd felt the avalanche coming, low and distant at first, gathering weight with every passing day. She didn't know yet what it would take to bring it down, but standing there in the fading light, rifle warm from her own hands, Silas close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him despite the cold. Clara understood that survival on this mountain was going to mean more than just rationing food and mending gloves. It was going to mean learning to want something for the first time in her life, and finding out, slowly, carefully, whether she was brave enough to reach for it. The mountain lion came out of nowhere, the way sudden death always seemed to on Widow's Peak. Silas had gone out before dawn to check the trap lines strung along the ridge, chasing the thin hope of fresh meat after weeks of stretched rations. Clara woke to Gideon's frantic shaking, his face pale in the gray morning light, pointing toward the tree line where a dark shape was staggering through the snow. She was at the door before she understood what she was looking at. Silas went down 20 yards from the porch, and by the time Cole and Gideon reached him and hauled him inside, his coat was soaked through with blood, his shoulder torn open in deep, ragged gashes that told the story plain enough. He'd fought the cat off. Barely, they laid him on the table, and for one long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Gideon's hands hovered over the wound, shaking in a way Clara hadn't seen from him before. Steady, careful Gideon, who never seemed to lose his composure. Cole stood frozen by the door, rifle still in his hands, eyes locked on his brother's face. like he was trying to will him to stay conscious through sheer force of will. Clara didn't freeze. Something in her, some old buried instinct from watching her mother tend wounds before the fever took her. Some quiet strength she hadn't known she still carried, rose up and pushed the fear aside. Boiling water, she said, her voice cracking on the first word, and then steadying, steadier than she'd ever managed before. Now, and the sewing kit, and whatever spirits you keep for cleaning wounds. Gideon looked at her, startled, and then moved. Cole moved a breath behind him, and within minutes, the table was cleared of everything but Silas and the tools Clara needed. Her hands didn't shake when she threaded the needle. She'd watched Gideon dress wounds before. The horses, mostly. A gash on Cole's arm from a fence line back in the fall. And she'd paid attention the way she paid attention to everything in that cabin. Quiet and careful, filing away knowledge she never expected to need. Now she pressed a cloth soaked in whiskey against the worst of Silas's wounds, and when he groaned through gritted teeth, barely conscious, she didn't stop. "I know," she murmured, the words coming easier now that there was work to focus them on. "I know it hurts. Just a little longer." She stitched the deepest gash first, her fingers steady, her breath even, while Gideon held the lantern close and Cole gripped his brother's good hand, like it was the only thing keeping either of them upright. It took the better part of an hour. By the end, Clara's hands ached and her dress was streaked with blood, but the wounds were closed, clean, dressed in strips of boiled cloth. Silas's eyes fluttered open once, glassy with pain and fever already creeping in. He looked at her, really looked, like he was trying to memorize her face. "Told you," she whispered. "We're not in a hurry." His mouth curved, just barely, before his eyes slid shut again. The fever hit hard that night. Clara sat beside him for hours, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, watching him shiver and burn by turns, listening to his breath rattle in a way that scared her more than the wound itself had. Gideon paced. Cole disappeared outside twice to chop wood he didn't need, working off a fear he had no other way to spend. By midnight, Silas was shaking so violently the cot rattled against the floorboards, his skin ice-cold to the touch, despite the fever burning through him. And the fire, no matter how high Cole built it, couldn't chase the chill from the room fast enough. Gideon was the one who understood first. He crossed to the stack of buffalo pelts against the wall, hauled the heaviest of them toward the cot, and looked at Clara with an expression that asked permission before anything else. Clara understood, too. She'd read enough, lived enough, to know what it meant when a body couldn't hold its own heat. Shared warmth wasn't scandal out here. It was survival. "Do it," she said. "Whatever it takes." They stripped down to what modesty allowed, undergarments only, and pressed close around Silas beneath the heavy furs. Gideon on one side, Cole on the other. Clara tucked against his chest where his heart beat, too fast, too thin, thudded beneath her ear. The fire crackled low behind them. Outside, the wind kept up its endless howl against the shutters. Clara had never in her life been pressed so close to another person, let alone three. She should have felt trapped. She should have felt the old panic clawing up her throat, the way it always had whenever anyone stood too near, breathed too close, reached for her without warning. Instead, surrounded by the scarred, solid warmth of these men who had done nothing but protect her since the night they pulled her from that trunk, she felt something else entirely. She felt safe enough to notice things she'd never let herself notice before. The steady rise and fall of Cole's chest against her back. The careful way Gideon kept a hand resting light against her shoulder, not gripping, just present, like he needed the reassurance of her being there as much as she needed his, the warmth radiating off all of them, slow and steady, chasing the fever's cold out of Silas's shaking body 1 degree at a time. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion finally pulled her under, and she slept pressed between three silent, dangerous, gentle men, and dreamed for the first time in her life of something that wasn't fear. By morning, the worst of the fever had broken. Silas's breathing had evened out, his skin warm again instead of ice. And when Clara stirred, and found his eyes open, watching her with a clarity that hadn't been there the night before. Something passed between them that neither one of them had words for yet. "You stitched me up," he said, voice rough with sleep and fever both. "You'd have died otherwise." Maybe. His hand found hers beneath the furs. Careful. Testing. Wasn't ready for that. Not with things left unsaid. Clara's breath caught. She didn't ask what things, she thought. Maybe she already knew. Silas healed slow, the way bad wounds always did. But by the time the last of the snow began its grudging retreat off the southern slope, he was walking without wincing, chopping wood again, despite Gideon's disapproving looks. And the cabin had settled into something that felt, to Clara, dangerously close to peace. She knew what was coming before anyone said a word about it. The trail was clearing. The gold was still sitting untouched in the strongbox where Silas had locked it away months ago. Spring meant freedom, the freedom he'd promised her that very first night, chalked out in careful letters on a slate board. She wasn't sure anymore that she wanted it, the morning it happened. Silas found her by the horse pen, watching the mustangs kick up mud in the thaw, and without a word, held out the leather pouch heavy with gold coin. He pointed south, toward the cleared trail, winding down off the mountain. Clara looked at the gold. She looked at the trail. Then she looked at him. This man who'd burned her contract, taught her to shoot, and held her hand through a fever that nearly took him. She pushed the pouch back into his chest. "No," she said, and her voice, for once, didn't stutter at all. Silas frowned, confused, maybe even a little alarmed, like he thought she hadn't understood the offer. He reached for the slate, hanging nearby out of old habit. But Clara caught his wrist before he could write a word. "I don't need the slate," she said. "I don't want your gold. I don't want the trail." Her heart was hammering, but her voice stayed clear, steady, hers in a way it had never quite been before. "I want to stay." Something broke open in Silas's face, some careful wall he'd kept up since the day they found her. And before she'd fully understood what she meant to do, Clara closed the last of the distance between them and kissed him. He froze for half a heartbeat, startled, and then his arms came around her, careful even now, even with months of wanting behind it. And he kissed her back like a man finally allowed to breathe. That evening, word passed between the brothers the way it always did, without a single spoken sentence. Just glances and small nods, and the quiet understanding that had carried them through a whole winter of survival. Gideon banked the fire high. Cole set aside his restlessness for once, and something in his eyes, when he looked at Clara across the table, held none of its usual wildness, only warmth. Clara understood, watching them, that this wasn't a decision made lightly, or made by one man alone. Whatever was growing in that cabin belonged to all four of them, and it always had, since the night they'd pulled her out of a locked trunk and given her a promise instead of a price. She went to them that night with no fear left in her at all. What passed between them afterward was slow and reverent, and nothing like anything her uncle's cruelty could have prepared her for or warned her against. It was Gideon's careful hands, reading her the way he read everything, patient and searching. It was Cole's fierce tenderness, wild energy, gentled down into something worshipful. It was Silas, steady and unhurried, murmuring her name against her skin like a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. They didn't rush her. They never had. Not once. Not from the very first night. And in the warmth of that cabin, surrounded by three men who had spent an entire winter teaching her that her voice, her body, her presence were things to be cherished rather than owned, Clara found something she hadn't known she was missing. She found her own voice, whole and unbroken, and the stutter that had haunted her since childhood simply wasn't there anymore. Not that night, and not in the quiet mornings that followed. She understood, lying tangled in furs as the fire burned low, and the mountain settled into a peaceful dark outside, that healing didn't come from being fixed. It came from being safe enough, loved enough, to stop needing to hide. The peace didn't last. It rarely did. Clara was learning, not on a mountain that seemed to test everything it touched. 3 weeks after the snow finally cleared the pass, Gideon came pounding up from the tree line at a dead run, breath-ragged, pointing hard toward the valley below. Riders, a dozen of them, maybe more, cresting the low ridge that marked the edge of Hayes' land. Clara's stomach dropped before she even reached the window. She didn't need Silas's spyglass to know who led that column. She'd have known the shape of her uncle's shoulders anywhere, hunched forward over his saddle horn. Even from this distance, he tracked us, she whispered. Silas was already moving, pulling rifles down from the rack above the hearth, tossing one to Cole, another to Gideon. His jaw was set hard, the careful patience he'd shown her all winter replaced by something colder, sharper. He tracked the gold, Silas said, voice flat. You're just the excuse. Clara's hands shook as she loaded the Winchesters Silas had taught her to use. Not from fear this time, from fury, hot and sudden, at the thought of her uncle's face, at the debts he'd sold her to settle, at the 12 armed men he'd hired to drag her back to a life she'd nearly died to escape. By midday, the riders had ringed the base of the ridge, close enough now that Clara could make out individual faces through the gap in the shutters. Bartholomew sat his horse at the center of the formation, a megaphone raised to his mouth, his voice carrying thin and reedy up the slope. Clara, I know you're up there. Send the girl down, and the gold my associate paid for her. And nobody else needs to die today. Cole's finger tightened on his trigger. Gideon's jaw worked, silent fury written plain across his face. Clara felt something cold settle over her, the old fear trying to claw its way back up, the memory of her uncle's hand raised, his voice sharp with contempt. And for one terrible moment, she thought the stutter might return, thought her voice might abandon her the way it always had whenever he was near. It didn't. I'm not going anywhere, she said, and her voice came out steady, loud enough that Silas glanced at her. Something like pride cutting through the tension in his face. A shot cracked from below, testing a warning shot meant to rattle nerves. It found the window instead, shattering glass across the floor, and a second shot caught Cole high in the shoulder before he could duck clear. He went down hard, cursing through his teeth, blood already soaking his shirt. Gideon was at his side in an instant, pressing a cloth hard against the wound, while Cole gritted through the pain, rifle still gripped in his good hand, refusing to let go of the fight, even wounded. Last chance. Bartholomew's voice rang out again, harder now, impatient. Burn them out if you have to. I want that girl, and I want my gold. Clara looked at the 3 men who had built her a slate full of promises and kept every single one of them. She looked at Cole, bleeding but still fighting, at Gideon, steady even now, hands quick and sure over his brother's wound, at Silas, rifle raised, eyes locked on the enemy below with the same cold calculation he'd once turned on a burning marriage contract. Whatever came next, she understood one thing with a clarity that settled deep in her bones. She wasn't running this time, not from her uncle, not from the men who'd hunted her across a mountain, and not from the voice she'd spent 18 years learning to swallow. She was done being quiet. The first real assault came fast on the heels of Bartholomew's ultimatum, a wave of gunfire that chewed splinters out of the porch railing and sent Clara diving for the floor beside the hearth. Silas returned fire from the shattered window, methodical even under pressure, each shot placed with the same careful precision he'd once used to teach her how to hold a rifle steady. 2 riders went down in the first exchange, more from luck than aim, the mountain lion attack having left Silas's shoulder stiffer than he'd admit. But Clara could see the toll it took on him, the way his jaw tightened with every recoil. Gideon had gotten Cole propped against the wall near the door, the wound in his shoulder packed tight with cloth, blood already soaking through, despite the pressure. Cole wasn't going to lie still, though. He'd forced himself upright, rifle braced one-handed against the window frame, firing with the same wild, unpredictable accuracy that had made him lethal on hunting trips all winter. Reload, Clara called, and didn't wait for anyone to answer. She crawled low across the floor, grabbing the box of cartridges from the shelf where Silas kept them, and began feeding rounds into empty rifles as fast as her hands could work. Her fingers remembered every lesson from those quiet evenings at the tree line. And now, with lead flying through the windows and her uncle's voice still ringing distant and furious from below, that muscle memory was the only thing keeping her steady. "Cole, arm," she said, tossing a fresh-loaded rifle toward him and catching his spent one before it could clatter to the floor. He glanced at her, something fierce and grateful flashing across his face before he turned back to the window and fired again. The bounty hunters weren't disciplined men, mostly hired guns paid by the day, and Clara could hear the uncertainty creeping into their shouted commands as the fight dragged on longer than they'd expected. Bartholomew's voice cut through twice more, ordering a push toward the porch, promising extra pay to whoever brought the girl out alive. "They're circling." Gideon signed. Quick motions Clara had learned to read over the winter, pointing toward the side of the cabin where the tree line pressed close enough to offer cover. Silas cursed under his breath, the first foul word Clara had heard out of him since the night they'd met, and shifted position toward the side window, just as two riders broke from the trees, rifles already up. Clara didn't think. She grabbed the Winchester Silas had trained her on, braced it against her shoulder the way he'd shown her, breathed out slow, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up snow a foot from the nearest rider's horse, but it was enough. The animal spooked hard, throwing its rider into a snowbank, and the second man wheeled away rather than press the advance alone. Silas looked at her for half a second, something between shock and pride flashing across his face, before turning back to the fight. The afternoon stretched into something bloody and relentless. Twice more, the bounty hunters pushed toward the cabin, and twice more they were driven back. The porch littered with spent shells and dark stains, melting into the last of the snow. Cole's strength was fading fast, his good arm trembling with every shot. But he refused to lay the rifle down, refused to let his brothers fight this battle without him. It was during the third push that things nearly went wrong beyond fixing. A grenade of black powder, crude and homemade, sailed through the broken window and landed near the hearth, fuse hissing. Clara's whole body went cold with recognition, and before Silas or Gideon could reach it, she was already moving, snatching up the water bucket kept by the door and dumping it square over the sputtering fuse. It hissed out with a wet spit, dead a foot from the fire that would have taken the whole cabin down around them. Silas hauled her back against his chest a half-second later, checking her over with frantic hands. And Clara realized her own were shaking now, the adrenaline of the moment catching up all at once. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wobbled on the words. "I'm fine, Silas." He didn't look convinced, but there was no time to argue it. Outside, Bartholomew's voice rang out again, sharper now, edged with real fury at the mounting losses. "You've got one more hour before I stop asking nice." Night was creeping in at the edges of the sky by the time the shooting finally slowed to an uneasy standstill, both sides too spent and too low on light to keep up the fight. Clara used the lull to check on Cole properly, unwrapping the makeshift bandage and finding the wound angrier than she liked. The bleeding slowed but not stopped. "You need this cleaned, right?" she told him, already reaching for the whiskey and clean cloth she'd used on Silas weeks before. Cole caught her wrist, his grip weak but insistent. Later, his voice, rare and rough from disuse, carried the weight of a man who understood exactly how bad their odds were getting. "Finish this first." Gideon crouched beside them both, his own hands steady despite the chaos, and signed something quick to Silas across the room. Silas's face went hard and thoughtful, the same calculating look he'd worn the night he read her marriage contract before burning it. "They'll come again at first light," Silas said finally, voice low. "Full force this time. We won't hold the porch." Clara looked around the cabin. This small, fortified home that had become the only safe place she'd ever known, and felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear and absolutely certain. She wasn't going to let her uncle take it from them. Not the cabin, not the men who'd given her a voice, not the life she'd only just started living. "Then we don't wait for first light," she said. "We end this tonight." The plan came together in whispers and hand signs through the deepest hours of the night. Clara crouched close to the hearth with Silas and Gideon while Cole rested, too weak from blood loss to do more than listen. It wasn't much of a plan. There weren't enough of them left standing to make it elaborate. But Clara had spent the whole winter learning the shape of this cabin, learning where things were kept. And she knew exactly what sat in the small shed attached to the side wall, close enough to reach through the connecting door without stepping outside into open fire. A half keg of mining black powder, left over from the winter's blasting work, clearing rockfall off the trail. It's enough to bring the whole ridge down if it goes wrong, Silas warned, reading her intention plain on her face before she'd even finished explaining it. Then we make sure it goes right, Clara said. Dawn broke gray and cold, and true to Silas's prediction. Bartholomew's remaining men came at the cabin in one final, desperate push. Numbers thinned from the day before, but still enough to overwhelm 3 exhausted defenders and 1 girl with a rifle. The porch fell fast. Silas was pinned down near the door, trading fire at point-blank range with 2 men who'd forced their way onto the steps, his rifle finally clicking empty at the worst possible moment. Gideon, out of ammunition himself, had grabbed a hunting knife and was fighting hand-to-hand with a 3rd man who'd breached the side window, both of them grappling across the floor in a desperate, silent struggle. Clara watched from the shadows near the shed door as Bartholomew himself kicked the front door open, splinters flying, shotgun raised and leveled straight at Silas's unprotected back. Enough of this, her uncle snarled, finger tightening on the trigger. Something in Clara broke open in that instant. Some final wall that had stood since childhood, built brick by brick out of every silenced scream, every swallowed word, every time she'd been told a girl like her didn't deserve a voice of her own. She stepped out of the shadows. She was holding a lit kerosene lantern in one hand, and beneath the other, resting against the low shelf just inside the shed door, sat the open keg of black powder, its contents pale and deadly in the dim morning light. "Bartholomew," she said. Her uncle's head snapped toward her, shotgun wavering as recognition and fury warred across his face. Clara's voice came out clear, crystal clear, loud enough to fill the whole cabin, carrying none of the broken hesitation that had haunted every word she'd spoken under his roof. 18 years of silence poured out of her in 6 words, steady and unshaking. "This is my home. Burn in hell." She hurled the lantern. It struck the powder keg dead center, and for one suspended heartbeat, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then the front of the cabin erupted in a roar of fire and splintered wood, the blast throwing Bartholomew backward through the ruined doorway and out into the snow, silencing his shotgun forever. Clara had already dropped and rolled clear the instant the lantern left her hand. Some instinct, older than, thought driving her flat against the floor as debris rained down around her. The remaining bounty hunters, caught in the edge of the blast or simply terrified by the sheer violence of it, broke and scattered, stumbling back toward their horses and fleeing down the mountain trail without a backward glance. Silence fell over Widow's Peak, thick with smoke and the smell of scorched wood. Clara, Silas's voice, hoarse and frantic, cut through the ringing in her ears. She felt hands on her shoulders, careful despite the urgency, pulling her up out of the wreckage of the shattered doorway. Her ears rang. Her whole body ached from the fall, but she was alive. And when she blinked the smoke from her eyes, she found Silas's face inches from hers, pale with a fear she'd never seen on him before. "I'm all right," she managed, and even now, with her whole body still trembling from the blast, her voice held steady. "I'm all right." Gideon appeared a moment later, blood on his knuckles, but otherwise unharmed, the man he'd fought lying unconscious near the window. He dropped to his knees beside them both, checking Clara over with quick, searching hands, and when he was satisfied she was truly unhurt, he simply pulled her into a fierce, silent embrace. Cole, too weak to stand but refusing to stay down, had dragged himself to the doorway and was staring out at the wreckage of the porch, at the scattered forms of Bartholomew's men. At the smoking ruin, where the front wall used to be. She did that, he said, voice raw with disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Clara looked out past him, at the mountain morning breaking gray and gold over the ridge, at the last of Bartholomew's men disappearing down the trail, at the body of her uncle lying still in the trampled snow. 18 years of fear, of swallowed words and quiet suffering, lay buried with him. She had found her voice in the worst possible moment, and it had been enough to save them all. The wreckage took most of the spring to clear. Neighbors from the valley below, word having traveled fast about the siege at Widow's Peak, came up in 2s and 3s over the following weeks, bringing lumber and nails and the kind of quiet, practical help mountain folk offered each other without needing to be asked. Clara worked alongside the brothers through every day of the rebuilding, hauling boards, holding beams steady while Silas and Gideon set them, feeding the small army of helpers who showed up each morning ready to work. Cole healed slower than the others, the shoulder wound stubborn and deep. But by the time the wildflowers started pushing up through the last patches of snow in the high meadow, he was back on his feet, back to pacing the tree line at dawn, back to the restless energy that had first caught Clara's attention on that terrible, wonderful first night. The cabin rose again, sturdier than before, wider too, room enough for a family that had grown without any of them quite planning it that way. Clara chose the color of the new shutters herself, a deep weathered blue that reminded her of mountain skies just before a storm broke clear. She didn't flinch anymore when thunder rolled through the valley. She'd learned, over that long, hard winter, that not every storm ended in ruin. Some of them, if a person was patient enough, if she let herself be found instead of hidden, ended in something worth keeping. The wedding, when it finally came, wasn't anything her uncle would have recognized as proper. There was no preacher climbing the mountain trail, no county clerk with a ledger and a fee, no legal paper to be signed and filed away in some dusty office 3 towns over. Clara had learned, painfully and thoroughly, exactly how little those papers were worth when the people signing them didn't mean a word of what they promised. What she wanted, instead, was simpler and truer. They held it at dawn, in the high meadow above the cabin, where the wildflowers grew thickest, and the whole valley spread out gold and green below them in the early light. Gideon had strung wildflower garlands through the fence rails the night before, working long past dark with the same careful patience he brought to everything. Cole had shot a wild turkey for the feast, insisting, with a rare grin, that a wedding needed proper food even if it didn't need a proper preacher. Clara wore a dress she'd sewn herself over the winter evenings. Simple, pale blue cotton, nothing fancy, but hers, made with her own 2 hands instead of chosen for her by a man deciding what price she was worth. She stood in the meadow grass, the morning sun warm on her shoulders, and looked at the 3 men who had pulled her out of a locked trunk in a blizzard and given her, slowly, patiently, the whole of herself back. "I don't need a preacher to tell me this is real," she said, and her voice, clear and steady and entirely her own, carried easy across the quiet meadow. "I found my voice in this place. I found it because you 3 never once tried to take it from me. You waited. You listened. You gave me room to become whoever I was always meant to be, instead of who I was told to be." She looked at Silas first, remembering the slate board, the burned contract, the patient silence that had never once made her feel small. "You taught me that safety isn't silence," she said. "It's choice." She turned to Gideon, remembering his careful hands, his gift for reading what she couldn't always say. "You taught me that listening is its own kind of love." Last she turned to Cole, remembering the way he'd knelt in broken pottery, and traced patterns on her back until the shaking stopped. "And you taught me that gentleness isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing a person can offer." There were no rings exchanged, no legal vows recited from memory. Instead, each brother took her hand in turn, and with the tip of a knife, warmed gentle over a small fire, traced a careful mark into her palm, a private promise inked into her skin the way their own scars had been written into theirs. Clara did the same for each of them, her hand steadier than she'd ever imagined it could be, marking 3 palms with a vow that needed no witness but the mountain itself. The feast that followed lasted well into the afternoon. Neighbors from the valley staying to share turkey and wild greens and the last of the winter's preserved fruit. Laughter and quiet conversation filling the meadow in a way that would have been unimaginable to the frightened, silent girl who'd arrived on this mountain in a blizzard. As the sun began its slow slide toward evening, Clara stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, watching Silas, Gideon, and Cole work together in the corral below, wrangling a pair of wild mustangs they'd caught earlier that spring. Their laughter, real laughter, rare and precious, carrying up on the warm mountain air. She thought about the girl she'd been, 18 years old, folded into a trunk, sold like cargo, silenced by fear and cruelty, long before she'd ever had the chance to know her own voice. That girl was gone now, buried somewhere, back down the mountain along with her uncle, and every lie he'd ever told her about her own worth. In her place stood a woman who had stitched a dying man's wounds with steady hands, who had learned to shoot a rifle and hold her ground, who had found, in the deepest silence of 3 broken, gentle men, the loudest, truest version of herself she'd ever known. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke, and Clara smiled, free and finally, completely heard, watching her husbands work the horses in the golden evening light. Home in every sense of the word that mattered. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations. And that is where Clara Vance's story leaves us not as the frightened girl hidden inside a wooden trunk, not as a piece of property traded by cruel hands, and not as a broken voice trembling beneath the weight of fear. She leaves us standing on a mountain porch, beneath a wide western sky, finally seen, finally heard, and finally home. This story is not only about survival in the harsh Montana winter. It is about the long, painful journey of a woman learning that she was never weak, she was only wounded. For years, Clara had been taught to shrink herself. She had been told that her voice was a burden, her fear was foolish, and her worth could be measured by a contract. But the mountain taught her something different. It taught her that silence can be cruel when it is forced upon someone. But silence can also become sacred when it gives a wounded soul room to breathe. Silas, Gideon, and Cole did not heal Clara with grand speeches. They healed her with patience, with waiting, with warm food, open hands, steady protection, and quiet respect. They never demanded that she speak before she was ready. They never treated her pain like an inconvenience. And because of that, Clara slowly discovered one of the deepest truths of love. Real love does not rush healing. Real love does not own. Real love creates safety, and inside that safety, a person can become whole again. The most powerful moment in Clara's journey is not simply when she picks up a rifle, or when she faces her uncle, or when she helps defend the cabin. It is the moment she realizes that her voice belongs to her, not to the man who hurt her, not to the men who saved her, not to the world that judged her. Her voice is hers. And when she finally says, "This is my home," she is not just defending a cabin. She is defending the woman she fought so hard to become. That is the lesson this story gives us. Sometimes home is not the place where we were born. Sometimes home is the first place where we are allowed to stop being afraid. It is the place where our scars are not used against us. It is the place where people see our broken pieces and do not turn away. Clara found that kind of home on Widow's Peak, in the arms of people who understood pain because they carried their own. And the story also reminds us that gentleness is not weakness. In the West, strength is often measured by who can draw fastest, shoot straightest, or survive the hardest winter. But Clara's story shows us another kind of strength, the strength to kneel beside someone who is shaking and not shame them for it. The strength to burn a contract instead of using it. The strength to listen when someone cannot speak. The strength to protect without possessing. That kind of strength may be quieter, but it is the kind that changes lives. Clara's uncle believed fear could control her forever. He believed the past had already written her future. But he was wrong. The past can wound a person, but it does not get the final word. Clara's courage was not born in one explosive moment. It was built slowly, over many small acts of kindness, many quiet mornings, many evenings by the fire, many chances to be treated like a human being instead of a burden. And maybe that is why her ending feels so earned. Because Clara does not become strong by pretending she was never afraid. She becomes strong by facing fear and choosing not to obey it anymore. She does not forget what happened to her. She rises beyond it. For every listener who has ever felt silenced, overlooked, or made small by someone else's cruelty, Clara's journey carries a simple message. Your story is not finished where they tried to end it. Your voice may tremble at first. It may come slowly. It may need time, patience, and safety before it returns. But it is still there. And when it finally rises, it can shake mountains. In the end, this Western tale is not just about a woman rescued from a storm. It is about a woman who becomes the storm when the people she loves are threatened. It is about healing without shame, love without ownership, and courage born from kindness. Clara Vance did not simply survive Widow's Peak. She claimed it. She rebuilt it. She turned it into a home. And as the sun sets over the Montana mountains, we are left with one truth burning brighter than any fire in that cabin. No one is too broken to be loved. No voice is too damaged to be heard. And no soul is too lost to find its way home.